and get. Oh, and thank you for that, Daisy. Daisy is going to record this. So don't everybody disappear from camera view. Stay with us. But I appreciate you guys hanging in there while I'm dealing with my sticky mouse. Love to see where you're all from. Keep bringing the comments in as we go through this evening. Feel free to put your questions and thoughts in the chat. And once we hear from Douglas, I will moderate and look at your questions and answers and make sure we have an opportunity to get to them. As you all know, when I read the books, I put a lot of prompts in my book so that I can ask a lot of questions. So I think we're going to have a fun evening this evening. So let me tell you a little bit about Douglas. He is a distinguished professor and emeritus at the Department of Ecology of Evolution at Stony Brook University in New York. And he's written several books. Books include Evolution and Science on Trial, The Case for Evolution. And he is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Science and also the National Academy of Science. And Douglas, I think I might have, in my notes, not properly characterized your books. So you'll have to help me out there with the books that you've written. So again, welcome everybody. Please feel free to join us on camera so that we can see your lovely faces. And welcome, Douglas. Thanks for joining us this evening. Douglas, you're on mute.
There. Thanks very much for inviting me to speak. This is clearly a large and very diverse group. We have someone from Venezuela. We have a friend of mine from Long Island. And I noticed that at least one audience member has a bird name, Mr. Peter Sperber. Sperber is a sparrow, I think, in German. And so this is a very diverse group indeed. So thank you for that kind introduction. I'll say just a few words about myself, and just to give you a sense of who I am and, beyond what Alicia has already said. So as she indicated, I am a recently retired professor, although still active in various professional contexts, at Stony Brook University on Long Island in New York, and where I was a faculty member almost since the inception of that university. I was a faculty, started there in 1970. And my background that I brought to that is growing up in New York City, actually in the Bronx, and becoming a naturalist there. Now, many people think New York surely would be no place to have any contact whatever with animals or plants. But the fact is that there are a lot of very rich parks in New York, just right in New York City itself. And I grew up going to some of these parks and basically learning birds starting at the age of 11, learning a lot about animals from around the world by going to the Bronx Zoo, and so I then I became totally enchanted with the diversity of animals, the diversity of life, and this led me then to when I became an undergraduate, which was at Cornell University.
Recording in progress.
It was an undergraduate at Cornell University, which was a wonderful place to get training in not biology generally, and in the taxonomy, the diversity of various groups of organisms. And that is what I brought then when I started my graduate studies at the University of Michigan, where I became really very, very interested in the question of how did all of this incredible diversity of life that I find so enchanting, but where did it come from? And the answer to that, of course, is Darwin's idea of evolution. Darwin was absolutely right about every species you look at is a descendant of a long run of ancestors going back more than 600 million years. And every bird we look at, every insect we look at, every plant we look at shares somewhere in the remote past an ancestor with us, okay? I have diverse bacteria living on my body and in my body. And way back in the past, there was an ancestral organism from which those bacteria are descended and from which I am descended. And this is a staggering kind of perspective to have on organisms. And so I came to understand, largely through some very inspiring teachers at Cornell, I came to understand that really every living thing and every feature of every living thing is a consequence of some kind of an evolutionary history. And that has led me into evolutionary biology as my theme, as my subject matter. I have ended up becoming fairly well-known, well, frankly, quite well-known internationally in my field, partly through having written a textbook of evolution at a time when there really weren't any competing textbooks. And so it was successful because it had essentially no competition. And that textbook, as it turns out, has been very successful. My co-author, the most recent edition and an edition that we have just finished, it will actually be published next month. I have a co-author on that, and that'll be basically the 8th version of that book that I started way back in the 1970s. So that's that. I have no professional qualifications as an ornithologist. I'm not an ornithologist. I'm a bird watcher. But I am an evolutionary biologist, and I can mention that my main research has been on insects, and in particular, the evolution and ecology of insects that feed on plants. And so there's a whole realm of things there that I'd be happy to talk about, but that would have to be another time. So that's what as I said, basically my life then has been, on the one hand, being professionally interested in processes of evolution and the history of the evolution of life. And on the other hand, being, if you like, an amateur naturalist, and having started birding when I started high school. And that is something that I'm still very enthusiastic about. I was out birding earlier today, as I am, especially since I'm retired. I'm kind of out a little bit almost every day. And it is a continuing source of great, shall we say, spiritual almost gratification to me. Well, I decided a few years ago that it would be nice to kind of put together my avocational interest in knowledge of birds with my professional interest and knowledge of evolution in a book that really had not been written before. And that is this book, which is called, I don't know if it shows backwards or right side, but anyway, the name of the book is How Birds Evolve. And what I've tried to do here is to explain how, from the perspective of evolutionary scientists, we can understand and really gain a greater appreciation of almost every aspect of birds, their diversity, where did all these, 10,000 plus species come from? How do we account for their geographic distributions? Why is it that we find trogons, for example, like the quetzal in Costa Rica? How is it that we can find trogons in tropical America, tropical Africa, and tropical Asia? What a very strange distribution. How can we understand that? Well, the answer must lie in the history of that group of birds, right? So some of this has to do with the history of birds, and I do indeed touch on, have a short passage on how birds evolved from dinosaurs, and they are living dinosaurs. But more than that, evolutionary biology provides insights into a huge range of different topics. And so the chapters of this book include where's the table of contents? One on how are all the different birds related to one another? I mean, how rather recently it's been found from DNA analysis that falcons are not closely related to hawks, but rather they're closely related to parrots and to the perching birds, the passerine birds that constitute about half of all bird species. A really most surprising result. That also is an example of what's called convergent evolution. That is, falcons and hawks have independently evolved a similar way of life. And so they have, a similar hooked bill, they have similar strong feet and large talons, and basically similar ways of getting their food. And so some aspects of the relationships among different birds, which are most closely related to which others, is one thing. Another is how birds are adapted to in various ways, adapted to their environment in terms of climate, and which of course is a very big issue. Are birds going to be able to adapt to climate change? How are they adapted to their various ways of life, the various things that different birds feed on, the various habitats that they occupy, the different ways in which they use their environment? One of the themes that evolutionary biologists study is variation within species. Not all individuals are the same, and how do we account for differences among individuals? And then I also have chapters on how do we account for different kinds of social behavior in birds? How do we account for different life histories? That you have albatrosses lay a single egg, and many game birds, or chicken-like birds may lay, 10 or 15 eggs. How do we account for those differences? So I sent a few slides to you and Daisy, and maybe it would be helpful if we just looked at a couple of those slides that simply touch on just a few of these themes that I just mentioned. So one is adaptation. This is a bird that, I dreamed for years of seeing this bird. And then finally in Ecuador, I got to see it for the first time. And I've seen it maybe 2 or 3 times since then in various parts of the Andes. This is a sword-billed hummingbird. If you know any Latin or Greek, you may be interested in its scientific name, which is Encifera encifera, which means sword bearer. And of course, it's a perfectly standard hummingbird, except for the fact that its beak is longer than its body by a good bit. And you ask, how come? How do we account for the evolution of such an extraordinary beak on this hummingbird? Now you can understand, of course, the first step is how do we account for adaptive characteristics in general? And this was one of the 2 great ideas that Darwin's Origin of Species contains. Darwin is responsible for 2 enormously important ideas. And one of them is, first of all, just the fact of evolution and common ancestry, the idea that I've already referred to, that all living things come from common ancestors. All life has a single origin. That is an amazing concept when you thinking of that for the first time. And I'll get into a little bit of that soon. And then his other great ideas, obviously, organisms have all kinds of features which fit them for their ways of life and the environments in which they live. And how do we account for those, what we call adaptations? How do we account for that? And his brilliantly original theory here was this theory of natural selection. The theory of natural selection is basically, he said, if we look at individuals of a species, we see that they're not all identical. They vary one from another, maybe in the length, slight differences in the length of the beak or the length of the wings or the body size or their metabolic rate or whatever. And we usually see that these variations to some extent are inherited. And so his notion was then, if a particular variant type was better suited for feeding or for contending with predators or for some environmental feature. If one variant form, one that has a slightly longer bill or a slightly larger body size or slightly shorter legs or whatever, if that was more successful in surviving or in reproducing, it would pass on that advantageous variant feature to its offspring. And in turn, the offspring would have superior survival or reproduction. And eventually that feature then would spread and become characteristic of the species as a whole, just because individuals with that characteristic are reproducing more than individuals that don't have that feature. So that's the general idea of natural selection. How would Darwin account for the sword-billed hummingbird? Well, Darwin didn't know about this particular species, but he did know about, I think, let's see what the next slide is. Daisy, the next slide. Hello?
She's working on it. It looks like her mouse may be sticky like mine. There we go.
Okay, go back. Yeah, there we are. No, there, stop. Okay, stop. Okay, so he didn't know about the sword-billed hummingbird, which is shown here again in the middle, but he did know about an orchid shown in the left-hand photo. And in orchids, as in many other flowers, the nectar is produced in an extension of the petals that form a long hollow tube called a spur, a nectar spur. Okay. And Darwin was a great fancier of orchids. In fact, he wrote a whole book about orchids. But he encountered many foreign, tropical orchids that were brought to Britain and were propagated in greenhouses there. And he saw this Madagascar orchid with a 10-inch long nectar spur. And Darwin, knowing a lot about natural history and a lot about flowers and whatever, said it must be pollinated by a moth. There must exist a moth with a proboscis, a tongue used for sucking up nectar, that was as long as this nectar spur. It must have a 10-inch tongue. Okay. And indeed, years later, decades later, exactly such a moth was found. And it's pictured there. It's a sphinx moth. It's one of the sphingid moths. And it's pictured there with its tongue uncoiled, so it's stretched out, and you can see what an incredibly long tongue that moth had, exactly as Darwin predicted. Okay, and Darwin said, "How do we account for this evolution?" Well, he says, as the pollinator, a moth, for example, evolved a longer proboscis that enabled it to obtain nectar. He said those individual plants which have the longest nectaries would compel the moths to insert their proboscis up to the very base in order to reach the nectar at the end of a longer nectary tube. Okay, and this consequently compelled the moths to insert their proboscis up to the very base so that its face would be right there in the flower, picking up pollen from the anthers. Okay, and so consequently, these flowers would be more almost guaranteed of receiving pollination and placing pollen on a moth to transfer to other plants. Okay, and so these plants would yield the most seed, those that have the longest nectar tubes, because they're most likely to be successfully pollinated, and the seedlings would generally inherit longer nectaries. And so it would be in successive generations of plant and moth. In other words, the plant evolves a longer nectar tube, the moth evolves a longer tongue to match. The plant is then selected to evolve a still longer nectar tube, which forces, shall we say, the moth to evolve a still longer tongue. And the result is something like that ridiculous orchid and its moth, or something like the sword-billed hummingbird. And here's an example of how evolutionary biologists go about testing, ideas or gaining evidence for hypotheses about evolution, even if it's evolution that has happened in the past. Because if Darwin is right, if you go out and study a species of plant that has long nectar tubes and has a pollinating insect, or a pollinating bird perhaps, that has a particularly long organ for reaching the nectar, you should find that those individual plants with the longest nectar tubes are most successful in being pollinated. And you should find that the insect, with the longest tongue, or the bird with the longest bill, will be most successful in actually obtaining nectar. And in the next slide, please, Daisy, we see no one's studied this with respect to the sword-billed hummingbird, but a research group in South Africa has studied this astonishing fly shown here on the left, which has an incredibly long tongue and pollinates very long-tubed flowers like the ones that you see here, which are members of the iris family. Okay. And in the right-hand graph, what you see is, so what did these researchers did? They basically went out and measured how much nectar, they looked at many, many individual flies. They would catch a fly, find out how much nectar it had actually consumed, and measure its tongue. And what you see at the top, in the top graph, every individual point is data from one individual fly. And what that shows is the flies with the longest proboscis, the longest tongue, on average tend to have to consume greater amounts of nectar. So the tongue is advantageous, just as Darwin predicted, because it does enable flies, the fly in this case, to get more food. And again, look at the bottom graph. Those flowers with a longer floral tube, basically a longer tube flower, they on average got more pollen deposited on them. So the vertical axis of that graph is the number of pollen grains deposited on the female part, the stigma of the flower. It measured again for many, many individual encounters of flowers with these flies. And what you see is, again, just as Darwin predicted, those flowers with the longest nectar tube, the longest floral tube, received the most amount of pollen. So it's a marvelous example of how evolutionary hypotheses can be tested. And so we can say there is now experimental support or observational support for Darwin's hypothesis published back in the 1860s. Well, as I said, no one has studied this explicitly for the sword-billed hummingbird. But I'll bet you anything that if you did study it, and it feeds indeed mostly on the nectar of very long-tubed plants, especially in the passion flower genus, I'll bet you could find data that look very much like this. So that's one theme in the book is various kinds of adaptations of birds and how we can go about exploring and getting evidence for hypotheses about why a particular characteristic might be adaptive. In some cases, it's pretty obvious. If you have a heron wading around in water, longer legs are better than short legs for wading in water, right? So that's pretty obvious. But in many cases, the features of birds are not that terribly obvious. What's the next slide, Daisy? So I mentioned that one of the things that evolutionary biologists like to study is variation among individuals of a single species. And why do they do that? Because remember, the basic proposition that of natural selection that Darwin created or envisioned and advanced is that there's variation among individuals of a species, and some individuals, some variant types, for example, those with longer bills, will tend to have an advantage in whatever they do, and consequently would tend to survive and reproduce more. And so that's one of the reasons that evolutionary biologists love to study variation and see how differences in a particular feature from one individual to another might affect their reproduction or their survival, and consequently be advantageous. And what are particularly intriguing are examples in which you have clearly different genetic types with different characteristics, in the same population of the same species. Because then you have to, well, why doesn't one just take over? How come you can have multiple types persisting in a species instead of one simply being better than the others and taking over, as Darwin predicted? And so many of you, for example, are familiar with white-throated sparrows. And there are basically two major color types of white-throated sparrows: those in which the head stripes are bright white versus those in which they are more of a tan color. And that's a genetic difference between them. And the question is, how come you have these two different types of white-throated sparrows? And I'd be happy to give you the answer to that if you want to ask afterward. But here's a particular case that has been studied extensively, especially in England. But just a marvelous example of variation within a single species. And that is in this bird, which is the European cuckoo. This is the one that sounds like a cuckoo clock. Okay. Cuckoo, cuckoo, cuckoo.
Douglas, we lost you.
Friend of mine.
Oh, there we go.
Right. Okay. So the photo was taken by a friend of mine who, like myself and many other birders from Long Island, drove up to Rhode Island to see this European cuckoo, or common cuckoo is its technical name, because they just don't occur in northeastern North America. This was just a staggeringly unusual bird. And so we went up there and saw this particular cuckoo. Now, what is really interesting about cuckoos, and it's been known for a long time, is that, so females lay an egg in the nest of another species, and the young bird hatches, and it is a nest parasite. It usually kills the actual nestlings of the that belong there, so to speak. So it's just like our brown-headed cowbird. Okay, and many of the bird, and it parasitizes quite a number of different bird species in Europe. And many of those bird species have evolved the ability to recognize that if an egg is different from their own eggs, they will toss it out of the nest. Because if it's a cuckoo egg, that's bad news. And so it's very adaptive to be able to recognize cuckoo eggs and throw them out of the nest. And what we find in the cuckoo is that there are different genetic forms of the same species, genetically different females, which lay differently colored and patterned eggs. Okay? And so what you see here is a series of 6 on the left, the typical eggs of 6 different species which are parasitized by the cuckoo in England. And on the right, these are the eggs of the corresponding genetic type of cuckoo who specializes in laying her eggs in one or another of these host species. And you see that except for the third one down, which is the egg of a dunnock, which apparently basically doesn't pay any attention to whether eggs look the same as eggs or not. But except for that one, what you see is that the different types of cuckoos, that are all the same species but different genotypes, genetic types, those different genetic forms of the cuckoo lay an egg which beautifully matches in color and pattern the egg of the particular bird species that type of female specializes on. So it's almost as if you had a whole bunch of different species of cuckoos, each one using a different species of host as a bird as its host, but it's actually different genetic types of the same species. So this is an example of what biologists call polymorphism, which means many forms in Greek. And so I've, this is one of a number of examples like that I discuss in the book. if you're interested in white-throated sparrows, you could ask me about them afterward. And there are a number of other examples of this that are really, in which basically studies of birds have really elucidated and shown how it is that you could have the persistence in a single species of different genetic types, each adapted in a somewhat different ways to different aspects of the environment. What would be next? The next slide.
So the next slide actually intrigues me, and I'm hoping that you're going to talk a little bit about behavior.
I certainly am. Yes,
okay.
I certainly am. Well, so this picture is not in my book. It's a collage that I've created just for this kind of presentation, which I've given a number of times. And these are 6 different species of birds of paradise found in New Guinea. I consider myself to be very fortunate that I've been able to travel around the world and see a lot of birds in something like 50 different countries. And of all those 50 different countries, if there's one that blew my mind, it was Papua New Guinea. And then subsequently, I went to West Papua as well on a different trip, because the birds of Papua New Guinea are just staggering. And the most staggering of all are the birds of paradise, which is a family of birds that's restricted to New Guinea with a few species in Eastern Australia. Okay. If you get a chance, there's a David Attenborough film about birds of paradise. I think it's called Attenborough in Paradise or something like that. If you ever get a chance to see that film, of course, he does the very best nature documentaries that I think anyone has ever done. But David Attenborough's one on the birds of paradise is really worth seeing. So these are 6 different species of birds of paradise. And I'll just quickly name them. At the upper left, you have this one with 2 long plumes coming off the head. The plume is considerably longer than the entire bird's body. It looks like it's made of plastic. This is the King of Saxony bird of paradise, named for the King of Saxony. And these and each of these plumes looks like it's actually made of plastic, sort of a row of plastic tabs, along a string. And the bird waves these around when it's courting. It's a male. And its courtship display consists of waving these things around while at the same time it's making a buzzing vocalization, and at the same time it's sort of bouncing up and down on a branch or a vine. And so, it's just mind-blowing to see that. That's King of Saxony's bird of paradise. The one underneath it is the blue bird of paradise, which has these amazing flank plumes, these really sort of frizzy looking plumes that it spreads out and displays. And the male does this while he's hanging upside down. Okay. To the right of that one, in other words, the lower middle one, is a greater bird of paradise. It's actually the same genus as the blue bird of paradise. And this again has this enormous, spray of plumaceous feathers that you can see, especially on the back. The one above it, I think, is just one of the most staggering birds in the world. It's a very small bird of paradise. It's a bit, a little bit bigger than a starling, I guess, called Wilson's bird of paradise. It's found on just a couple of small islands along the coast of West Papua. I feel very fortunate to have seen this bird really close up. This meant leaving at 3 o'clock in the morning and hiking up a long, slippery trail in the mountains to be at the right site well before first light, and in time for the guides, our local guides, to be sure that the blind was in good shape. And the blind consisted of essentially like a fence row of fern fronds, just to form a kind of wall with lots of little chinks, between the fern leaves that you could look through. And so we stretched down on the ground and lay very quietly. Everyone said, okay, find your own little chink in the ferns to look through and wait. And at first light, almost at first sight, this Wilson's bird of paradise comes in. And he was there to clear the ground of his display area. We're looking at his display area. And he busily picks up every dead leaf or whatever on the ground, and carries it away, throws it away, and then he basically started moving up and down on this vertical stem. But look at that bird. I mean, it's got a bald, brilliant electric blue head. It's got yellow and brilliant red on the back, and it's got the craziest tail feathers of any bird in the world. I mean, look at those two curled tail feathers. Absolutely insane. To its right is the I'm blanking on the name. Why am I blanking on the name? Rifle bird, which is one of the birds of paradise that basically sits up on a dead post of some kind, dead tree, and displays its wings in that very dramatic way, at the same time displaying its bright, brilliant, iridescent green throat. And then the lower right is this is almost a rival with the Wilson's bird of paradise for favorite bird. Again, we watched this again through a blind. I think a blind that David Attenborough had made for this bird. And this is a male that comes down and dances. I mean, it really dances back and forth in a very stereotyped set of steps. That would be, worthy of a stage in New York, and does this again and again and again, with its breast feathers, long breast feathers spread out. Now, what's this all about? What is this all about? This is insane. And of course, it was Darwin who, I don't think he ever saw birds of paradise, but he knew plenty of other birds that were equally, stunning in their male displays. And it was Darwin who came up with the notion of sexual selection. And he said sexual selection is it's a form of natural selection in which different individuals of the same species differ in some feature that enables them to reproduce, to mate more successfully. And in the case of these males, a male will be able to mate with more females if he has some feature which either repels other males, competing males. And that would explain, for example, the horns of many antelopes and deer and so forth. It's a way of, fighting off other males and getting the females for yourself. Or he said, these features surely act as something that females find attractive or beautiful. He had the notion that female birds have some standard of beauty, of what constitutes male beauty, and that they would then tend to prefer males that corresponded to this notion of beauty. And this was an idea that was not at all popular in his day. The whole idea that first of all, ascribing importance to females wasn't something that was done very much in Victorian England. And secondly, the whole notion that birds could could have some sort of an aesthetic sense, and that they could make choices of this kind, was just like too radical for people to swallow. Well, of course, it turns out that Darwin was absolutely right. His idea of kind of languished for decades, really. It was somewhat revived in the 1930s, but then again kind of neglected until the late 1960s and the 1970s, when a lot of biologists started really exploring this and doing experiments of various kinds to show that Darwin was absolutely right. And I think the next slide shows one of those early experiments. No, that's going backwards. Yes, thank you. So this is one of the first experiments to show that, yep, Darwin was absolutely right. So this is the long-tailed widow bird that you can see in grasslands of Eastern Africa. And again, this was a bird that I went to Kenya, and I was like thrilled to see this bird. It was a bird I really looked forward to seeing. because I knew about these, this study. So, so here's this long-tailed, well-named long-tailed widow bird, and with obviously a very, very long tail, a ridiculously long tail, clearly an ornament of the kind that Darwin postulated would make males attracted to females. And his notion was the more exaggerated this ornament is, the more stimulating, the more appealing it would be to females. Who knows why? I have to ask that question. Why would females prefer this? Anyway, so this is work by a Swedish investigator, Malte Andersson. And in the upper, and what he did was to basically, well, you'll see, in the upper graph, we have the number of nests per male in four arbitrarily chosen, groups of males in different, out there in the savannah. And what he found was, there were a number of males in each of these four groups. And basically what he found is that a male will attract several different females that then, build nests and lay eggs that are his offspring. And so you see these four groups, and they pretty much all have pretty much the same success in the number of females they attracted. Then Anderson started clipping tail feathers. And you see that in the group at the left, he clipped off their tail feathers so that they were shortened, and he pasted those clippings onto the tail tips of the birds that are in the right-hand column, so that they now had tails that were much longer than any widow bird that any female had ever seen before. Okay. And then in the middle, we have two control groups, one of which he cut the tail feathers and then pasted them back onto the same individual. And that was to control for the possibility that the process of being handled and so forth, might have affected the male's behavior or success or whatever. And what you see, the result is that for some period after this experimental treatment, the males continued to attract more females. And what you see is, at the left, having a shortened tail is not good for you if you're a male. You attract very few females. And at the right-hand side, you see that females responded like crazy to males that had tail feathers that were far beyond what any real male widow bird ever has. This is, what behavioral biologists have called a supernormal stimulus, meaning well beyond the normal, but that it somehow or another stimulates a response. And this kind of response to exaggerated stimuli is something that students of animal behavior had described long before in other contexts. And so, for example, if you have an oyster catcher and you roll one of its eggs out of the nest, the oyster catcher will try to pull it back in with its bill. And if you simply place an egg outside the nest of an oyster catcher, it will try to do the same. And the investigators found if you make an artificial egg that is like twice as big as a normal oyster catcher egg, the oyster catchers go crazy trying to get this, even more vigorously trying to get this back into the nest. So in other words, these exaggerated abnormal stimuli, it's as if these birds are pre-programmed to respond to highly exaggerated stimuli. And this is true in humans too, and you can see it in advertising basically anytime you turn on the television, and especially if you have attractive-looking women way beyond, or attractive-looking men way beyond the average level of attractiveness, right? So this beautifully shows that Darwin was right, that indeed females do prefer certain kinds of males with exaggerated characteristics, and that this would account for the evolution of these ridiculously long tail feathers, which are kind of literally a drag for flying males, and would also account for all these wild characteristics in those birds of paradise that I showed. And of course, we look around and you look at the birds that you're familiar with, and what we see here in eastern United States are many examples of just this, but they're not as dramatic. These ornaments aren't as dramatic as the peacock's train or the widow bird's tail feathers. But barn swallows, for example, The outer tail feathers of barn swallows, as I think almost everyone here knows, are elongated into these kind of streamers. And it turns out, it has been shown experimentally, that females prefer males with longer streamers. And if you shorten those streamers, you make a male less appealing.
So Douglas,
yeah,
we have a question. We have a question for you.
By all means.
I don't know if you can see it, but Jean is asking about the widow birds, the long-tailed widow birds. Are they related to red-winged blackbirds? And she puts...
No, they certainly look like red-winged blackbirds, don't they? I mean, extraordinary. You're absolutely right. I mean, that could be a red-winged blackbird if you just sort of, didn't look at the tail feathers. But no, they're in a separate family of birds altogether. It's a family that's related to the house sparrow family, whereas red-winged blackbirds, the blackbird family, which also includes the orioles, is restricted to the Americas, to North and South America. And so this particular coloration, as well as the kind of courtship display, flying around displaying these red shoulders, among other things, that's evolved independently in these two different birds. No, that's a great question. Thank you.
And thanks for taking the time to answer that. We only have a few minutes left.
Yeah, sorry I just got carried away. So
it's lovely.
Let's please open for whatever questions, and for as long as we can stay.
Yeah. Folks, any questions? I haven't seen any come up in the chat, but sometimes I do miss them. But I do have a question that I do want to ask you.
Well, you also had about 100 different pink flags in your copy of my book.
I did. And as you put a couple things, as you were talking about some of your slides, I put the page numbers of where some of these things could be found. And you have a cool picture of the cuckoo. You have the cuckoo picture in here. And then you have also the Wilson's Bird of Paradise in here. And when I looked at the picture in your book of the Wilson's Bird of Paradise, it almost looked like a beetle to me when I first looked at the page, just because of the really way out colors and the way it looked with those funny tail feathers. But I have a question going back to your youth. So you asked some great questions at the beginning of your book, things that you answer for the most part, as I read through your book. But I can't help but wonder, at a young age, you were very interested in animals. Birds, of course, are animals. So, but between when you were a boy and when fascinated by animals and when you went into university and got your education, what was kind of the oomph that got you into the evolution? You talk a little in your book about some behaviors
Sure. Yeah. I think I was probably already, sort of pre-programmed in that direction because I had, I already in high school, I was sort of vaguely learning about, how different species come from, common ancestral species and so on. But this became crystallized when I took some of my courses, even as a freshman at Cornell. I'm basically taking, effectively in introductory biology. I took introductory zoology, introductory botany, and entomology. All of those were among the courses I took as a freshman. And all of them, the professor would refer to evolution and say something about the evolutionary background. The botany professor, for example, he studied the plant paleontology, the fossil record of plants, and so he talked about how there had been, the evolution of different groups of plants over the course of geological time. And very importantly, I took a course in ornithology as a freshman. And and part of the content of this course included studies by the professor of species formation in birds. This was Charles Sibley, a name that some of your audience might have heard. And he had studied, for example, interactions between differences between Baltimore orioles in the east and Bullock's orioles in the west, and how they hybridize with one another. And he was, talked about that these surely were, immediately descendants of the same ancestral species, and that they hadn't quite become fully different species yet because of the hybridization. And he gave a number of other examples like that. So I was really intrigued by Charles Sibley, the ornithologist. And then when I was a sophomore, a new faculty member arrived in entomology department, a guy named William L. Brown, who just everyone called him Bill Brown. He was a big guy with a big beer belly, and he loved to go out to the bars at night and just hang out with other people and drink beer. But he was the world's expert on the taxonomy of ants. And he also was just really interested in processes of evolution, and in particular, how new species form and come into being. And so when he arrived, he started holding, just lunchtime get-togethers, everyone bring a bag lunch. And often he would hold forth on his ideas, some of which were great and some of which were a little wacky. And I learned from him that you could question authority. I learned from him that there's a lot that's unknown about how species form and other aspects of the evolutionary process. And so a really important realization, and I should say that I then took his entomology course, and along with a friend of mine, and in the morning he would give a lecture that usually had something to do with evolution. And at lunch, my friend Jim and I would talk about his lecture and decide that we weren't sure we agreed with him. And in the afternoon, we took the entomology lab, which meant learning different insect groups. And he would come in to the lab basically just to talk with me and Jim, to basically argue. And so I learned from him that there's a lot that isn't known, or a lot that is debatable because the evidence could be interpreted one way or the other, and that there's a whole world of research opportunities to understand various aspects of evolution better, as well as, of course, that would be true of biology in general. So they were really very inspiring teachers. Yeah.
That is fascinating. Douglas, this has been absolutely fascinating. You have a lot of fans here. We could go on for a long time, but unfortunately, we do have to end this session. I encourage all of you that have not had an opportunity to read or look at his book. Daisy, we have copies available for sale. So you can go to our website, order those books, reach out to Daisy and get your copy of this book. And I am so thrilled that you were able to join us, Douglas. Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us. And I do wish we had more time, but it feels like we're going to have to bite you back again.
So do I. I mean, I'd love to keep going for another hour or so, but I think you're right. Time's up.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we do have to end our day, but let's think about, how do we get you back to share more, because it's absolutely fascinating. Thank you again so much for being here this evening. And thank you all for joining us. Pick up your copy of the book, give it to somebody you love as a holiday present coming up, because we have to think about who we need to cross off of our gift list. And we will see you at our next Bird Book Club in December, and the one in January, and so forth. And Douglas, we'll see about how we can get you back on board.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and thank you all for attending. And I hope it was interesting. Okay. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.
Aisha, thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Daisy. Thanks for making sure that it was recorded. Have you stopped the recording maybe?
I'm stopping.